that the British colonizers have done in India. We first had the liberation war between East Pakistan and West Pakistan, and then East Pakistan became Bangladesh. The Chittagong Hill Drugs was located in East Pakistan, so East Chittagong Hill Drugs became part of Bangladesh. But issues continued with language and cultural rights, even food habits, even their farming process is very different.
You're listening to Across Archives, a space that highlights storytelling projects, archives, and oral histories that share the experiences of migrants, immigrants, internally displaced people, and refugees around the world. Here, we explore a wider community of storytellers, archivists, advocates, and scholars whose work inspires our own at the Refugee Archive. Together, these efforts bridge divides, build solidarity, and reshape how the record of displacement is remembered.
Hi, I'm Kristi, and I'm joined today by Rumana Hashem. You're a political sociologist, a feminist, criminologist, criminology educator, a visiting fellow at the Research Center on Migration and Refugees at the University of East London. You're also a coordinator of the working group for archiving and documentation of history of forced migration, and an executive member of IASFM, responsible for program affairs and innovation. And you have a PhD in gender and armed conflict in Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh. That's really interesting. From the University of East London, and has a postgraduate diploma in migration and gender from the University of Hanover, specialize in interdisciplinary qualitative research in cultural and social research, migration, gender harms, intersectional feminist pedagogy, and decolonizing criminology. On the editorial board of Displaced Voices at a Journal of Migration Archives and Cultural Heritage. You are also a co-investigator of the Living Archive project and a lead researcher of civic engagement project titled Democratic Access or Privileged Exclusion. Research served as a pilot to engage with irregular migrants and local displaced communities in London who've told their lived experiences and have enabled the establishment of the Living Refugee Archive through recording of life histories. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would love to unpack how we got here with this really big web of background and how you made your way here.
That's a good question. How did I get here doing this kind of migration, but also taking archive and history in perspectives as well? When I first actually came from Bangladesh, my PhD was about gender violence and conflict in the Chittagong Hill Drugs, southwest Bangladesh. Actually, the people in Chittagong Hill Drugs belong to Buddhism and Hinduism. There were 45 different indigenous communities living there, but they have very different language as well. They are all actually slightly different, although the Chakma is known as the majority population, so that's not the only language. And so their cultures were very different too. But the British, by mistake, as they do often, mixed up people by mistake, has put them with Pakistan, but Pakistan was Muslim Islamic country. So the conflict was obvious and the conflict started. Conflict means the tension and the domination and then a kind of a new colonization and state assimilation soon after the partition of India. And then the Chittagong Hill Drugs had later become part of Bangladesh because Pakistan government was Yahiya's government was military government, and they also denied the rights of language. The linguistic rights and the cultural rights of the Bangladeshis, the Bengali people, who were also part of Pakistan, which was known as East Pakistan. So first we had the conflict that was so long ago before my birth. The history is so complex in the whole subcontinent. Indian subcontinent was divided into pieces when the British had left but did not leave, because we still are, suffering for everything that the British colonizers have done in India. We first had the liberation war between East Pakistan and West Pakistan, and then East Pakistan became Bangladesh. The Chittagong Hill Drugs was located in East Pakistan, so East Chittagong Hill Drugs became part of Bangladesh. But issues continued with language and cultural rights, even food habits, even their farming process is very different. So soon after the liberation war, the new Bangladesh government, who fought for language, they told the people in Chittagong Hill Drugs to become Bengali. So the prime minister, who had a reputation for being a generous and so capable of leading the liberation war, told leader of Chakma people who came to meet him in the park before they have completed the constitutional changes. And that's soon after the liberation war, about language and cultural rights. So the fight for freedom or autonomy in the Chittagong Hill Drugs was obvious. But then the state assimilation is a very similar history, but at a small scale, as we see in Palestine today, the Israel-Palestine conflict. The Bangladesh government sent a lot of people, 7,000 Bengali at the time. 7,000 means a big population. So they were sent to settle in Chittagong Hill Drugs. The whole concept of progress and modernity was installed in that part of the world by the British, who first told them to become modern, and they were called uncivilized and primitive people. Bangladesh government put militarization caused forced displacement, and forced displacement caused further conflict. 27-year armed conflict. The people in the Chittagong Hill Drugs wanted to fight back. Systematic ethnic cleansing for 27 years. Now there are only 13 indigenous groups remaining in that part of the world. However, the reason for me to come in the UK was to look at what happened to women and non-binary people in the context of fighting the gender violence. I focused on women, and Bengali women have been experiencing this conflict and what happened post-conflict. The Hill Drugs Accord was signed in 1997. Violence, especially gender violence, rape, sexual abuse of many forms, continued today. I moved back from Brighton, because I was teaching at the University of Brighton last year. I was teaching criminology there. And I moved back in London last year in October. And that's the first thing was that after I moved in, we had a protest outside of Parliament on the 19th of October 2024 about gang rape against Indigenous women by people who should not have been there. My reason to come to the UK was to do a PhD. I had a scholarship from the University of London. I started at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, actually. And my supervisor was a working class feminist, radical feminist. But she couldn't find a scholarship for me. So later I transferred the PhD to UL. University of East London is known as UL. So I will be using this term UL. And I did the PhD with my supervisors, an exiled Jewish, not Zionist as such, exiled Jewish feminist, expert in intersectionality and gender, nation, and state. I was interested in working on this. And then my other supervisor was also an exiled Serbian feminist. She worked for peace in former Yugoslavia during the war, and then was exiled. She was an expert in conflict and ethnicity, particularly women, ethnicity, and conflict. When I was doing this PhD, I was part of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. It's called HSS. And my PhD research center is Center for Migration, Refugees and Belonging. And that's how I became interested in more about forced displacement. My interest was not only the forced displacement, because this is known history, what happens with development project, because main in causes are threefold. One is that to look into the state assimilation in the name of development, whatever kind of development wherever it happens. And then looking into intersectionality of gender, ethnicity, race, nation, state, class divisions, and unities as well. Like you and I can be united on the question of gender, age, or sexuality. Sexual orientations bring people together. But for me, it was ethnicity, race, class, gender, and state and nation at that time. But when I'm looking into these in terms of the subjectivity of who is getting victimized and where, and that's very important in any context, whose story are we talking about? So in my PhD, I talked and told the stories I was told by the indigenous women, victims of gendered violence in the armed conflict, but also many men who are classified through the class divisions, brutalized by the state assimilation. And then the third thing that brought me in this particular archiving migration and their forced displacement in story, I was meant to be working at the Center for Migration, Refugees and Belonging. Both my supervisors in the first week suggested me, oh, but then you can't go because it is such a dangerous job. When I went to do my field work, I was house arrested for 3 days. They don't let me go out, call it house arrest. It is if you're not letting me go anywhere without military, the captain or the adjutant. They say, we will show you around and you can do your interviews. So I have to come out of the military jeep, Pajero jeep, and then interview people. Why would people bother to talk to me? I decided not to go to any villages to scare off the villagers that she comes from a military car. My supervisor said, you can't go back to Bangladesh, Rumana. You would find a lot of things. They suggested that I would find a lot of materials in the archives. I came to the archives, started doing work. I spent 6 hours minimum a day researching because the center didn't have the materials. So we would go back to the PhD room later. I also met people coming in. When I was talking about what I have been doing, now I understand how unfortunate it has been to finish the PhD. After your PhD, people don't understand what you have really done and how much work you put in. They just think, oh, she got a doctorate. But it's not just a doctorate. It's the long, painful process to go through to train yourself as an academic researcher, scientific researcher. But during the PhD, people did ask scholars, what is your PhD about and how are you doing? I mentioned the archive often. I said, what's interesting here is it is not the research center. All the books, all the documents I find in their archive. I meet my friends, scholars, colleagues, students. People were like, what is it? It's Refugee Council archive. The refugees themselves, the people that I was talking to, a lot of displaced people, asylum seekers, the people seeking asylums, or the undocumented migrants. I had many because I'm also an activist. That's it. That's how I think this is a simple answer. The activism around these issues across the migration, bordering, displacement, forced displacement, gender harms, I call it, gender harms through displacement and migration in a complex bordering immigration system. People are having difficulties in giving birth, a simple birth. So the complex process of birth is also affecting their children. So the children, when they're growing up, they're either suffering from social anxiety, dyslexia, autism, sensory issues are related to these issues, that what the mothers go through and the family go through during the pregnancy process. All of these are important, but people were saying, Refugee Council Archive, where is it? It's in university. The first thing is struck people is that, oh my God, the Refugee Council Archive is within a university. So they didn't have the right to access the campus at that time. It has changed over time. You wouldn't believe how many people are accessing this campus now, but that's only since COVID. During my PhD here in the UK was 2007 October. From 2007 October to 2017, ordinary people didn't have access to this archive. That brought me to think about what is it the archive for and who is it for? If the archive is really preserving documents and archive is meant to be saving the truth, I would say, facts about migration, then this archive should be placed in somewhere that people can access. But then the second question is that if the archive is only for certain people and it cannot be accessed by all the people, then this archive, should it exist or not? Or is it only privileging some people or not? Those kind of thoughts came across mind. And that was during the PhD final years. When I finished PhD, that's when I was subjected to immigration policies myself. I was already married and I had permanent residency in the UK, got my that document, that national ID document for the permanent residency in 2012. But then when I finished my PhD, finish means when when the PhD has been conferred to me in 2014, then I discovered by that time immigration policies changed. So that's when I really focused on migration issues. So that's a long answer.
I understand your interest in the history of your homeland. Those in displacement have really interwoven not only in your personal life, but in your studies, advocating for people, being an advocate for yourself and figuring out how to tell your story. So a few interesting things, because I can relate. My dissertation is on vulnerable, displaced, single mothers, and how they are able to use agency, use their narrative to influence what happens in their world. Policy, jobs, childcare. One of the things you said was about accessing these populations and meeting them where they're at to tell their authentic story, which you need to affect change or understand the situation deeply. When there's gatekeepers, limited access, as there was, we saw in Gaza, Palestine, and as you saw when you were trying to do your field studies, it prohibits these vulnerable populations from being able to have and own their own agency or narrative.
Exactly.
Can you talk about that?
I wanted to know about those who are really not allowed even to go to certain places without a pass. They would have to tell where they're going, when they're coming back to their hostel and refugee home. It doesn't make sense to have an archive if you don't let those people whose voices are meant to be preserved and documented and maintained in an archive for people like myself and yourself or Paul or whoever want to do research. If these voices are only saved for us, then these archives do not have the right to. So it was nice to come up with the project. Democratic access and privileged exclusion was actually the theme for Paul's master's dissertation. I suggested we keep looking into the lived experiences of people going through asylum seeking in London.
The experience happening to you is limiting or preventing you from archiving, researching, and being the lead, as you said, on a project. Yes. It has impacted your ability to tell other stories, to archive other stories, to research other important stories. It's limited you.
It's always limiting. Even now, talking about ethics and consent in archiving, this is one project I wanted to work on. I have the knowledge, training, and skills, but I'm not able to submit a funding bid to the UKRI. The UKRI is the UK-wide research initiatives, right? In research and investigation that we would be doing within UK or about the UK, but you have to be a permanent, not just a full-time academic. I was a full-time academic in different universities for many years, but you would have to be a permanent full-time academic to be able to be the one to submit and lead the funding bid. to lead a project for UKRI funding. Without that, you can't be the principal investigator. So I can't submit, and I'm not going to give away my ideas for other people to become principal investigator, and I would have to be just a research fellow. It hurts. So a lot of, you're right, a lot of good projects are not happening because of these discrepancies. You are talking about what happened to me, but I'm trying to relate this metaphorically, how so many others have been stuck by policies that do not even allow our archives to be accessible to all people.
Thank you for that. Let's move on to your recent projects and your plans. What are some projects you're working on currently?
I'm a visiting fellow here. I'm talking to you now online from a computer in the University of East London in the archive. And I'm working here almost every day at different times. I'm not paid here. I'm also teaching for the Politics and International Relations course, but I'm not getting paid. Most importantly, I'm talking from a computer that I do not have direct access to. So I had to log into via Paul's account because I'm still waiting for the University of East London's staff account. This is how complicated it is. So I can't possibly plan it out. It's already end of October for 2026. And I don't actually have access to safe internet. I can go to a cafe or a public library, which I do. I did email you from a public library the other day when I sent you the information. But should we have to do this way? Why should we? So these are projects that I would be really interested in, but it's not that core thing that I'm focusing on. One of the projects we've just started for the Center for Migration, Refugees and Belonging, we mainly focus on projects around migration and refugee and immigration, and bordering and belonging. Belonging here is not about integration. Belonging is who belongs and who cannot belong and who is meant to belong and not allowed to belong, creating a space where we belong and unbelong. If we don't want to belong, we can unbelong. For me, yes, from the University of East London, I can unbelong any moment. But to belong is a process. I am belonging. I still have my PhD student card. And when I was a lecturer, I had a staff ID card. But I'm not quite able to belong right now. So one of the projects that I've been thinking, and we have already had a little discussion with an ex-artist colleague, fellow, who also worked for the Refugee Council Archive, that if I get this staff account, and if the Center for Migration, Refugees and Belonging can validate their next year's, you have to validate your research centers. Every year, we would like to do an interdisciplinary, not just multidisciplinary, taking of course, intersection approach, but decolonial intersectional artist project. So the artist will be working closely with people in the ground to come up with some, what she called is brick building blocks. She does great work. Some of her artworks are at the backside, you will see. We would choose Newham because the University of East London is based in Newham. So Newham, Silvertown, where she wants to work with the working class, not only British, but working class communities. So that means that the workers' history to look into, but taking a lens, intersectional lens, would mean to look at also how the migrant workers, whether the migrant workers are experiencing it differently, how the migrant workers are experiencing it, how the women or the young people and children of different communities experiencing the history of Silvertown. That means it's kind of looking at, she suggested from 1850 or even going behind. So that means 2 centuries of struggles and how the UK became the Newham today's Newham became today's Newham and why.
Sounds like a great project.
So what happens that basically I put the research in, thank you so much, I think, too ambitious, but we would need a lot of money. And for this, we need UKRI funding. To get that funding, we would need the PI to be a permanent staff. We would need the directors to be able to do that because I can't really apply for that funding. I will be doing the work, I will be applying, but someone else need to sign it and submit it on our behalf. So it will be a collaboration between Center for Migration, Refugees, Belonging, Refugee Council, and the University of East London's new law and psychosocial studies. They don't exist psychosocial psychology departments, so we can go through different disciplinary interventions.
That's great. You have given us a lot to think about and to unpack, and I am going to put a lot of links in your bio and underneath this video. I have lots of links to some of the things that you talked about in your papers. And but is there any kind of last thing that you would like to say before we conclude today?
Well, I think thank you so much for giving me this option to talk. You mentioned the ethics in archiving displacement narratives. I would like to talk about that. We talked about ethics from the accessibility aspect, but consent in archiving displacement narratives reminds me of issues during the civic engagement project. I was an unpaid researcher, but I was, of course, the main researcher. And so I was doing field work, collecting interviews, connecting with people, and then designing. We both, of course, Paul also contributed. We, as a trio, we met for research questions and doing the ethics forms for consent when discussing the people giving us time, especially for academic research. The people who are participating in the research, we look at them as just participants, but that is very problematic to look at because they actually make the research happen. Otherwise, the research wouldn't happen. We had to negotiate with our universities. Institutional ethics is different because if you go to third sector, for those who don't know what third sector is, third sectors are any of those sectors other than government and the academic sectors. So the third sector would mean NGOs, corporations, and any other activist groups, all are third sectors. So for NGO research, for example, Oxfam or ActionAid, they normally give a little bit voucher or offer something to the people who participate in their research or any projects for their time. But when we do research in the university, including my PhD, we are told not to at all think of any sort of compensation. There is this problem. Do you really offer people compensation? Because then it is called your research is biased. Ours was co-designed with people involved. We didn't call them just participants. We called them active participants in the research or co-workers. So they wanted compensation because they were giving us a lot of time. 2 hours from somebody's life because we collected oral histories. Oral histories require emotion. You're just leaving the person after saying, okay, when I publish it, I will share with it. That's not good enough. So we did offer them, I think it was £20 voucher. But it was a big challenge because the university was like, what do you mean? Oh, you think you have to pay? And it's not pay. We are just giving the voucher for the essentials or transportation because they have given time. And doing any research with displaced people actually requires this kind of compensation. And that is something that I really feel eager to establish. But I don't know if we could ever come up with an agreement on this question. But it was appreciated by our participants because it felt like a real collaboration.
Thank you for sharing that. I think those are some important points too. And some of the ethical balance that everyone is making and making sure they have ethical stories and they're getting real, authentic stories without influence. There's a balance there.
And then, of
For
course, the
sure.
archive to be making it accessible, which we have done through the Living Refugee Archive, which is the online portal. So the people who participated in this research, who made it possible, are not getting excluded from knowing what is going on with their data and also new stories that are coming, they could actually access without having to make themselves visible to the archive as such, because many have accessibility issues in terms of documented and undocumented regular migration. So yeah, these are things I think.
Yeah, thank you. Stay strong. This is going to work itself out. I wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to Across Archives, a project by the Refugee Archive. Our conversations here highlight the storytellers, archivists, and advocates who are shaping how migration and displacement are remembered. If you'd like to go deeper and hear the voices of women living these experiences firsthand, join us on The Archive Speaks, our oral history audio archive, featuring powerful stories from female-headed households and single mothers in displacement around the world. Together, Across Archives and The Archive Speaks preserve memory, amplify unheard voices, and reshape how we understand the experience of displacement. Listen to The Archive Speaks wherever you get your podcasts, or visit the Refugee Archive to explore both projects and learn more about our work.